My name's Leo and I'm a boat builder and a sailor, and I'm on a mission to rebuild and restore this 109-year-old classic sailing yacht, Tallyho. Now this week I'm going to be asking the question, is this boat still the Tallyho? I'm going to be looking at the Ship of Theseus, which is an ancient Greek philosophical question, and I'm going to be talking a bit about what is going to be left of the original and what's still left to replace. While I'm talking about all this, we're going to be catching up with the work that's been done up until now, starting with when I was first shown Tallyho down on the coast of Oregon a couple of years ago. First time I'm coming aboard Tallyho. Overwhelming to see the amount of work to do here. So the Ship of Theseus is actually one of the oldest problems in Western philosophy. Theseus was supposed to be a great war hero, and after he got back from conquering all of his enemies, his ship was stored in harbour as a sort of museum. Now, over the years, various bits of the ship needed to be replaced, and eventually every part of the ship was replaced with new timber. Now, the first part of the question is, of course, is that boat the same boat? Then it gets more complicated by saying that all the pieces which were taken off were stored in a warehouse, and after some years had gone by, the technology was there to restore these rotten pieces of wood and put them back together in the shape of the original ship. So now you've got two ships, one of all the original parts which had been taken off and then put back together, and one which had been replaced bit by bit with new parts and sort of remained in the same space, as it were. Now, I'm going to explain some of the theories behind the Ship of Theseus, but it's important that I point out that I'm probably going to have some kind of bias because this whole project that I've sort of devoted my life to at the moment is based on trying to rebuild an old historic boat rather than simply building a new one or a replica. But I'm not going to try and convince anyone one way or the other, because in fact it doesn't actually matter to me what people believe in terms of this boat. I do have my own reasons for rebuilding it the way I'm doing, and I'm really quite happy with that. What I am hoping is that this video will answer some questions and will be a resource, because I get asked an awful lot how much of the boat is going to be original and is it still the same Tallyho. So what I'm hoping is that people who are wondering these questions will be able to see this video and at least see what my answers for those questions are, and then they can make up their own minds. Now, there's a lot of different theories or answers to the question of the Ship of Theseus, but all the theories, they sort of question our sense of identity and the way we identify objects around us. One theory questions the actual definition of what makes something the same as another thing. Another theory suggests that we need to consider a fourth dimension to really get to grips with this question. This theory actually uses the example of a river, and so you can imagine a river flowing and you might recognize the river, the shape of the river. You might even recognize features of the river, say a specific whirlpool that is in a certain place, and you might come back every day and see that, but of course every time you look at that it's actually got different water. The matter that makes up that shape is different. And if you take that theory to its sort of opposite extreme, you can kind of suppose that at each moment of time even the same object becomes a different object. So, you know, there's a theory that this notepad, say, while I'm holding it, is one object, and when I put it down here, it's a different moment of time, it's therefore a different object. It's now a notebook on a plank rather than a notebook in my hand. You can even suppose that the actual electrons and neutrons, the subnuclear composition of this object, this notebook, is constantly changing. And so on that level, it is not the same object as I was holding a few moments ago. Another theory is that there is no ship. The idea of a boat or a ship is just a human construct, just a label that we give to a sort of collection of pieces that are arranged in a certain way. This is something that I quite identify with, because I like the idea that if you change the objects in that arrangement, if you change the things that this overall object is made of, then as long as the human mind can conceive of it as the same thing, then that is as close as you can get to being the same thing. That's one of the reasons, for instance, why I decided to rebuild this boat in the way that I did. Rather than tearing it all down and starting from the bottom, I have the idea that if at any one time you can look at this boat and see what looks like a boat in the same place, then therefore that is the same boat in the same place. So we've talked a little bit about the theories and got some good ideas, but maybe no definite answers. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of legal and cultural side of when a boat might become a new boat. Legally then, according to Lloyd's of London, any boat that is rebuilt until it is completely renewed does remain the same boat. And this was famously quoted by Joshua Slocum, the first man to sail alone around the world in the late 1800s. And he wrote an amazing book about his adventures, which I thoroughly recommend. And he did a similar thing to his boat before he started rebuilding it until there wasn't much left of the original. In fact, all over the world, and especially the wooden boat world, there are many cases of this happening. Oftentimes boats not only have a lot of their structural parts replaced, but they actually change quite a lot as well. There was a famous schooner built in Newfoundland called Jenny, and over her life she was raised and she was lengthened, and she had an extra mast put on, so by the end she was barely really recognisable, but to her crew and her owners and so on, she was still the dear old Jenny. In fact, in boat building culture, a lot of boat builders, when they're doing a complete rebuild, will just demolish the boat essentially and then start from scratch, building maybe on top of the old keel. In many ways that's very sensible and something I could have done here, but my own idea of identity is that if you can look at any one time at an object and see it there looking at least vaguely like what it's supposed to be, and you have that continuity through the rebuild, then that's sort of good enough for me to say that it is the same thing. One of the interesting things about wooden boats is that they are built so that they can easily have their structural parts replaced, and back in the days when traditional boatyards and shipwrights were not so rare, it was a part of everyday maintenance to replace planks and frames and sometimes parts of centre lines on boats so that they could continue working. More recently, of course, there's been less infrastructure to get that sort of work done, especially affordably, and so boats tend to get neglected. Even if their paintwork and so on is trim, often there will be structural issues which aren't addressed as they should be, and of course it can quite quickly go downhill, and before you know it you've got to rebuild the whole boat. In these cases, like in Tallyho's case, what you end up doing is catching up on several decades worth of neglected maintenance, and as you're doing that it makes a lot of sense to make the adjustments or improvements that would maybe have been made in her life if she had been properly kept up. Personally, I have no doubt that this boat is the same one that was launched in 1910 in England. I like to consider the boat, or any object really, like an organism, like the human body perhaps, where each cell dies and is replaced, and after a certain amount of time none of the cells in your body are the same cells that you were born with, and yet you appear to be the same person, at least in some respects. You certainly carry your name forward unless you change it, which boats can also do. You could also consider a company, for instance, say an iconic company which produces iconic products. Over time, all the people in that company might change and the products that they make might change, but they might still be the same company and retain that identity. What's interesting about this for me is it makes me think about how we use language to understand the world around us. A boat, or even the name of a boat, is just a word that we've invented to make this world easier to compute in our heads. We separate everything that we can see or experience into tiny little squares that we can label, and that helps us make predictions and communicate about what's going on and so on. But the reality isn't like that. The world isn't made up of separate things. It's all just a big massive gloop. And even if you look at it scientifically, it's very hard to make the distinction between separate people and objects. As a person, I am constantly interacting and part of my environment, both through sight and hearing and breathing and eating, and at what point does that air or that food become part of me, and at what point is it part of the environment? And I guess my point here is that by thinking about this we can learn something deeper about our interaction with the world around us, and that is that we can choose to separate things in our minds and consider ourselves as separate from our environment, or we can consider that these labels that we make are not necessarily the ultimate reality of life. Therefore, I propose that the question, even is it the same boat, is a meaningless question, and in fact calling this thing a boat at all or giving it a name is meaningless in itself. And in a completely meaningless world, what better thing to do than rebuild an old wooden boat and go sailing? So I'll be the first to admit that I did not quite realise the scope and scale of this project when I took it on. Had I known that I'd have to replace almost everything in the boat, I probably would not have started this project. But I'm glad I didn't know, and I'm glad I did start. Originally I was hoping to reuse the entire centerline and most of the planking. Of course, as I uncovered the centerline, I realised that I had to replace more and more of it, and finally resigned myself to replacing all of it. The planking is a real tough one because it's made of teak, which is a really good timber, and quite a bit of the timber is still sound. However, it's got a lot of fastening holes in it and it's really quite worn. So reusing it would create a lot of extra work and would also introduce quite a lot of weakness into some parts of the boat. Now, I've bought enough new planking stock to hopefully replank the whole boat, but I am still thinking about reusing a couple of the original planks and putting them in there more for the sake of the history than anything else. But it's important to me that I'm rebuilding the boat to be used, and she's got to be as strong as possible because I intend to sail her vigorously and to the furthest ends of the oceans. I never wanted this boat to be a museum piece, and in fact she never would have been, because, you know, although she's got some fame and some prestige, she never would have been preserved just for her history. The history of this boat is certainly a large part of her identity, but I don't think it is the entirety of it, and I don't want to relegate this boat to history. I want her to continue to make history, in fact. In terms of what I'm reusing on the boat, the most significant thing is of course the large lead ballast keel. That piece of metal is completely original and is a large portion of the boat's weight, so that's quite a significant piece of the original. Other than that, I don't want to promise anything, but I certainly really hope to use a lot of the planking for internal joinery, so bulkheads and cabinetry and so on. There's a lot of good wood there which may not be good for planking anymore, but which would be good for making other things with. There's various bits of hardware and metalwork which I'll be able to reuse, and I'd be really keen to reuse the big original capstan of the boat, although that would certainly need some rebuilding in itself. Well, thanks a lot for staring at my ugly mug for so long as I ramble on about this stuff, and a massive thank you to everyone who's donated or otherwise supported the Tallyho project. It makes a huge difference, and it means I'm able to take the time to make and edit these videos, so I really appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Cheers.